They kicked me out on a Tuesday. Not violently, not with shouting or theatrics. The bank manager was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a voice that stayed gentle even as she explained that the foreclosure was final, that I had until Friday to vacate, that she was very sorry for my loss, but the mortgage was 4 months delinquent and there was nothing more she could do. I signed the papers with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago. Shock has a shelf life. After 9 months of watching everything collapse, my body had learned to go numb. The house on Laurel Street had been ours for 6 years. Garrett and I bought it the spring after we married, back when his salary at the engineering firm felt limitless and my job at the design studio seemed stable. We painted the bedroom sage green together, argued about whether to keep the ancient oak in the backyard, planted tulip bulbs that came up yellow every April. Now it belonged to strangers. I had 4 days to extract 7 years of married life and fit it into whatever came next. Scout sat beside me in the bank parking lot, her golden head resting on my thigh. She was 6 years old, gray creeping into her muzzle, and she had been Garrett's idea. He brought her home as a puppy 2 months after our first anniversary, this wriggling ball of copper fur with eyes like warm honey. We named her Scout after the girl in the book Garrett was always quoting, the one about mockingbirds and moral courage. He used to read to her from the porch while I cooked dinner, his deep voice carrying through the screens. Scout curled at his feet like she understood every word. She pressed closer now, some ancient canine instinct sensing the grief that lived in my bones. I buried my fingers in her fur and stared at the stack of eviction notices on the passenger seat. 4 days. Then what? Garrett died on August 14, 2022. No warning, no slow decline that might have prepared me. He was 37 years old, pulling weeds from the garden bed on a Saturday morning, and he just stopped. Collapsed between the tomato plants and the zucchini vines, his heart already gone by the time the ambulance screamed into our driveway. Massive stroke, they said. Genetic defect in a blood vessel no one knew existed. Could have happened any time. He was lucky it didn't happen while he was driving, while he was on a ladder, while he was holding something fragile. Lucky. That was the word the doctor used. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. Garrett had been meaning to increase the policy, had the paperwork half filled on his desk, but meaning and doing are different countries. What remained after the burial and the flowers and the reception at the church fellowship hall went straight to the mortgage company, to the credit cards we had maxed buying furniture for a future that no longer existed, to the hospital bills from his final ambulance ride. I paid what I could. It was not enough. Then the design studio downsized in February. 12 of us called into the conference room on a Friday afternoon, handed severance packets in manila envelopes, thanked for our contributions. The owner looked genuinely pained. The economy was brutal. Clients were cutting budgets. She wished there was another way. I cleaned out my desk in 17 minutes and drove home through rain that felt personal. After that, it was just arithmetic. Unemployment covered groceries and gas. It did not cover a mortgage built for 2 incomes. I made it 3 months before the letters started arriving, cream envelopes with bank logos, language that began polite and grew colder with each iteration. I stopped opening them after a while. The outcome was inevitable. So here I sat in May sunshine that felt obscene, watching people walk in and out of the bank with their deposits and their loans and their ordinary problems, and I had 4 days to figure out how to live. The house was full of boxes by Wednesday. I had been packing in stages for weeks, knowing this was coming, even if I could not say it out loud. Dishes wrapped in newspaper, books sorted into keep and donate, Garrett's clothes still hanging in the closet because I could not bear to touch them. His scent fading from the fabric, but not gone, not yet. His mother had offered to help, but I told her no. This was something I needed to do alone, this dismantling of the life we built. I found the notebook in his workshop. The garage had been Garrett's domain, the place he retreated when his mind was too loud, when he needed to work with his hands instead of blueprints and computer screens. He kept it obsessively organized, tools hung on pegboards, screws and nails sorted by size in old jam jars, a workbench scarred with decades of projects. I had avoided going in there since he died. Opening that door felt like trespassing in a shrine. But the estate sale people were coming Friday, and I needed to sort through what to keep, what to sell, what to simply abandon. So I stepped into the smell of sawdust and motor oil and let the grief hit me fresh. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His safety goggles sat on the bench. The calendar on the wall was still turned to August, frozen on the day the world ended. The notebook was in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, buried under old tax returns and warranty information for appliances we no longer owned. Leather cover worn soft with handling pages filled with Garrett's careful handwriting diagrams drawn with straight-edge precision. I almost put it back. Then I saw the title page. Off-Grid Living, a Manual for Self-Sufficiency. I sat down on the concrete floor and started reading. Garrett had dreamed of leaving. Not me, not our marriage, but the grid, the system, the crushing weight of mortgages and utility bills and dependence on structures designed to fail people like us. Page after page detailed his research: solar panel arrays and battery banks, rainwater collection systems, passive heating and cooling rocket mass stoves built from salvaged materials. He had calculated the costs, sketched floor plans, listed skills he needed to learn. Welding, carpentry, basic electrical work, how to butcher a chicken, how to can vegetables, how to live on almost nothing and call it freedom. I had never seen this notebook before. Never knew it existed. There were notes in the margins, dates spanning 3 years. He had been working on this quietly, privately, maybe not even consciously planning, but definitely preparing for what retirement seemed too far away. He was 37 when he died. We had decades before we needed to think about stepping back. Or maybe he saw something I missed. Maybe he felt the foundation cracking beneath us even when everything looked solid. The last entry was dated August 10th, 4 days before he died. Just a single line: checked property. Structure sound. Need to clear brush around foundation before winter. Property. What property? I flipped back through the pages looking for context and found none. References to the land, to the site, to the location, but never an address, never a name. Like he was writing in code, like he expected me to already know. Then I remembered the filing cabinet. If the notebook was in the bottom drawer, what else was hiding there? The deed was in a manila folder labeled miscellaneous, which should have been my first clue that Garrett was hiding something he did not want me stumbling across. The document was dated November 2020, 3 years ago. A land purchase agreement for 2.3 acres outside Bend, Oregon, 12 miles from where we lived. Purchase price $3,800. Down payment $1,900. Balance financed over 5 years at 6% interest. Monthly payment $32.17. Garrett had been paying $32 a month for 3 years and never mentioned it once. I sat on the garage floor surrounded by the wreckage of our life and stared at the address, 2847 Old Mill Road, Bend, a place I had never heard of, land I did not know. We owned a secret my husband kept while we talked about everything else. We shared a bed and a mortgage and a dog, and he was quietly buying property in the hills, planning an escape route, building a dream he never invited me to see. Except he did invite me. He just ran out of time to say it. I spread the notebook open next to the deed and read the last entry again. Checked property. Structure sound. He had been there. Walked the land. Inspected whatever structure came with it. 4 days before his heart betrayed him in the tomato plants, he was thinking about this place, about our future there, about the day we would need to start over. The day we would need, not want, need, like he knew. Like some part of him sensed the hammer waiting to fall. I pulled out my phone and looked up the property on satellite view. 2.3 acres of scrub and pine, a dirt road snaking in from the highway, and in the center of the clearing a long curved structure that looked like a half-buried tube. A Quonset hut, if I remembered Garrett's lessons correctly. Military surplus from some forgotten era, corrugated metal bent into an arch, the kind of thing you could buy for almost nothing because no one wanted them anymore. The kind of thing that could be a shelter if you were desperate enough. I checked the loan balance. After 3 years of payments, Garrett still owed $1,943. Pocket change in the old life, a fortune in the new one. I had $4,100 in my checking account. Everything left after the house was stripped, after the debts were paid, after I sold the furniture and the dishes and everything we owned that had resale value. $4,100 between me and sleeping in my car. If I paid off Garrett's secret land, I would have $2,157 left. Enough for maybe 2 months of cheap rent, somewhere 3 if I starved. Then nothing. Or I could go look at what he bought. See if this dream of his was real or just another beautiful plan that died with the dreamer. Scout lifted her head and looked at me with those honey eyes, patient and trusting, like she knew I was trying to solve an equation with too many variables. She had been Garrett's dog first, but she was mine now, this living piece of him that still needed feeding, still needed walking, still tethered me to the world when grief made me want to float away. Whatever I decided, she would follow. That was her job. That was love. I folded the deed and tucked it in my pocket. Then I carried the notebook into the house and started packing what was left of my life into something that would fit in a car. The GPS led me out of Bend proper on Thursday morning, down progressively smaller roads until pavement gave way to gravel and gravel gave way to dirt. Old Mill Road was barely a road at all, just 2 tire tracks through pine forest and dry grass, the kind of place you only found if you were looking for it or lost beyond hope. Scout sat in the passenger seat with her head out the window, ears flapping in the wind, unbothered by the jolting ride or the uncertainty waiting at the end of it. I almost turned back twice. Once when the road narrowed to the width of a single car and branches scraped paint off both sides. Once when I passed a rusted mailbox shot full of bullet holes and realized how far from anything resembling civilization I had driven. But Garrett's notebook sat on the dashboard, his handwriting visible through the windshield, and I kept going because stopping meant accepting that I had no idea what to do next. The clearing appeared suddenly, pine trees giving way to open space like a curtain pulled back. 2.3 acres looked smaller in person than it did on a map. A rough circle of land scrub grass and volunteer saplings and not much else. And in the center, exactly where the satellite image promised the Quonset hut, it looked like something left over from a war. Corrugated metal curved from ground to ground, forming a half-cylinder 20 feet wide and maybe 40 feet long, the whole structure painted a green that had faded to gray-brown and peeled away in long strips. Rust bloomed around every seam and rivet. The front end had a door, or the frame of one, the actual door, hung crooked on broken hinges, gaps wide enough to see through. No windows, no porch, no sign that anyone had touched this place in decades except Garrett, who had somehow looked at this wreck and seen possibility. I parked the car and sat there with the engine ticking, trying to understand what he had been thinking. This was not a fixer-upper. This was not a diamond in the rough. This was a corroded tube of metal in the middle of nowhere, the kind of thing you paid someone to haul away, not something you bought with money you hid from your wife. Scout whined and pawed at the door. She wanted out, wanted to explore, wanted to claim this strange new territory. I let her go and watched her sprint across the clearing, nose to the ground, tail high. At least one of us was optimistic. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, pine sap and dry earth and something that might have been sage, a sharpness that cut through the grief fog I had been breathing for 9 months. I walked toward the hut, slowly, boots crunching on gravel and dead grass, trying to see what Garrett saw. The metal was solid despite the rust. The structure had no sag, no lean, no sign of imminent collapse. The door was broken, but the frame was intact. Maybe he was right. Maybe the bones were sound. I pulled the crooked door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim light filtering through rust holes in the ceiling and gaps where the metal met the ground. Dirt floor uneven and packed hard. Smell of dust and old air and faintly, very faintly, motor oil. Empty except for 3 wooden pallets stacked against the far wall and what looked like a coil of rope half buried in the dirt. No insulation, no wiring, no plumbing, just a metal shell and space. But it had a roof, it had walls. It kept the wind out mostly, and it was mine, or could be for $1,943. I walked the length of it, boots echoing on packed earth, and imagined what Garrett must have imagined. A floor raised off the ground, walls insulated against the cold, a stove in the center simple and functional, solar panels on the roof feeding batteries, feeding lights, a door that closed and locked, a space that held warmth, held safety, held the possibility of starting over. He had planned this for us, for the day we needed it, and that day was here. Scout appeared in the doorway, backlit by morning sun, and barked once. Not a warning, just a statement. She approved. This would do. I pulled the deed from my pocket and read the terms again. $1,943 to own this land, this structure, this chance. Then I would have $2,157 for materials, for tools, for food, while I figured out how to make this work. 2 months of money if I was careful. 1 month if I was honest. Garrett's notebook had a section titled First Month Priorities. I had read it 3 times last night, memorizing the steps. Could wait. He had calculated costs. 8 could wait. He had calculated costs. $800 for lumber and screws and basic materials if I bought smart and used salvage where possible. Another $200 for tools I did not already own. That left $1,157 for food, for gas, for the inevitable emergencies. It was not enough. I knew that. $1,100 does not carry you far, does not build a life, does not solve the problem of needing to eat and feed a dog and survive until some theoretical future where stability returned. But $4,100 did not solve those problems either. It just delayed them. At least here I had a roof. At least here I had a plan, even if the plan was written in another man's handwriting. At least here I had a purpose beyond watching the money drain and the options narrow and the walls close in. I walked back outside and called the number on the deed. A woman answered on the second ring, voice professionally pleasant. I told her I wanted to pay off the loan on 2847 Old Mill Road. She asked me to hold, put me on music that sounded like elevators, came back 2 minutes later, and confirmed the payoff amount, $1,943.18. Could I come by the office this afternoon? I could. I would. I hung up and looked at Scout, who was digging a hole near the tree line, dirt flying between her back legs, completely absorbed in the work. She would be fine here. She would adapt. Dogs are better at that than people, better at living in the present instead of mourning the past. I took a breath that tasted like pine and dust and commitment. Then I drove back to town to sign the papers that would make me a landowner, a gambler, a woman with a corroded metal hut and a dead husband's dream, and nothing left to lose. The loan office was in a strip mall between a dollar store and a place that sold custom embroidered hats. The woman behind the desk looked exactly like she sounded on the phone, professionally pleasant and mildly curious about why anyone would want this particular piece of property. She did not ask. I did not explain. I wrote a check for $1,943.18, signed the release forms, and received a stamped deed that said I owned 2.3 acres of Oregon scrubland free and clear. She handed me the paperwork in a plastic folder and wished me luck. Something in her voice suggested I would need it. I sat in the car and looked at the bank app on my phone. Available balance $2,156.82. Everything I had left in the world minus the car and the boxes of belongings I had not sold and the dog currently asleep in the back seat. I should have been terrified. Should have felt the weight of this mistake crushing down, this idiotic leap into a life I knew nothing about, this trust in a dead man's half-formed plans. But what I felt instead was something stranger. Something that might have been relief. For 9 months I had been drowning in decisions I could not make. Problems I could not solve, a future I could not see. Every choice led to another dead end. Every path circled back to the same conclusion. I was alone and broken and running out of time. But now I had a direction. Stupid maybe. Desperate certainly. But a direction. A place to point myself. A project that needed hands and time and will, things I had in surplus, because what else was I going to do with them? I drove back to the house on Laurel Street for the last time. the estate sale people had already been through, tagged everything with prices, turned my marriage into inventory. I ignored them and loaded the car with what I had marked as essential clothes, sleeping bag, camping stove, the toolbox from Garrett's garage, a cooler for food, Scout's bed and bowls. The rest could go to strangers. I did not need it where I was going. Friday morning, I handed the keys to the bank manager with the kind eyes and drove away from the only home I had known as a married woman. Scout sat in her usual spot, head out the window, watching the familiar streets disappear behind us. She did not know we were not coming back. She trusted me to take her somewhere safe. I hoped I was not about to break that trust. Old Mill Road looked different the second time, less intimidating, more like a path I was choosing instead of stumbling onto. The clearing appeared, and I parked in the same spot as before, killed the engine, and sat in the silence that was not really silence. Wind in the pines, birds I could not name, the distant hum of a highway too far away to see. Home, I thought. This is home now. The word felt too big for the reality. Home was supposed to mean comfort, safety, walls that kept the world out and warmth in. This was a rusted tube on bare ground with a broken door and dirt floors, and no running water, no electricity, no anything except possibility. But Garrett had believed in it, had planned for it, had spent 3 years paying $32 a month to make sure it was here when we needed it. And he was right. We needed it. I needed it. I unloaded the car, slowly carrying boxes and bags into the hut and stacking them against the far wall. Scout explored every corner, sniffing and marking and claiming territory. I set up her bowls near the door, filled one with water from a jug I bought in town. She drank deeply and then curled up on her bed, satisfied. The sun was setting by the time I finished unloading. Orange light slanted through the gaps in the walls, painting rust streaks gold. I stood in the center of the space and turned in a slow circle, trying to see the future. Walls sealed tight, floor raised and level, warmth from a stove, light from panels on the roof. A place where I could breathe without choking on loss. It seemed impossible. All of it seemed impossible. But so did living through Garrett's death, and I did that. So did watching the house slip away, the job disappear, the savings drain to nothing, and I survived all of it. Maybe impossible was just another word for not yet. I pulled Garrett's notebook from my bag and opened it to the first page, his handwriting steady and clear. Day 1, secure the structure. Make it weather tight. Everything else can wait. Day 1. That was today. That was now. I found a headlamp in the camping supplies and strapped it on. Then I picked up the hammer from the toolbox and went to work on the broken door, the first of 1,000 small repairs that would turn this wreck into shelter, this shelter into home. Scout watched from her bed, head on her paws, eyes tracking my movements. She did not understand what I was doing or why. She just knew I was here, and that was enough. Outside, the sky burned itself out in shades of coral and violet. Darkness came on fast in the forest, no streetlights to hold it back. But inside the hut, my headlamp cut a white circle through the shadows, and my hands moved with purpose. And for the first time since Garrett collapsed in the garden, I felt something that was not grief. I felt ready. The first week passed in a blur of small failures and smaller victories. I fixed the door by scavenging hinges from an abandoned chicken coop I found half a mile down the road, the metal crusted with rust but still functional. Patched the worst holes in the roof with aluminum flashing bought from the hardware store in town, each piece cut to size and sealed with caulk that stuck to my fingers for hours afterward. Cleared the interior of debris and swept the dirt floor until it was almost level, almost clean. Scout appointed herself supervisor, lying in the doorway and watching my every move with patient interest. The work was harder than Garrett's notebook made it sound. He wrote in clean steps, logical progressions, as if determination and a hammer could solve anything. But metal fought back. Wood split wrong. Measurements that looked perfect on paper turned crooked in practice. My hands, soft from years of office work and design software, blistered within the first 2 days. The blisters broke and bled and formed calluses that cracked and bled again. I learned to wrap them in duct tape before starting each morning. Learned to work through the sting because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant drowning. Money drained faster than I planned. The hardware store became my second home, trips twice a week for screws or wire or some tool I did not know I needed until the project stalled without it. $80 for basic lumber, $40 for insulation batting that would line the walls, $60 for a saw that could cut straight when my hands could not. Each purchase felt like an emergency, like the difference between shelter and exposure. But they added up to $380 in the first month, and the balance in my account shrank to $17.76, and the fear started living in my throat. I needed work, real work, something beyond selling off the last pieces of my old life. The farm appeared on my third trip into town, tucked behind a stand of pines on the east side of the highway. Hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post. Fresh eggs, seasonal produce, no pesticides. I almost drove past. Then I saw the woman kneeling in the garden rows, gray hair tied back with a bandana, and something made me pull over. Her name was Hazel Brennan, and she looked at me with eyes that had seen their share of hard seasons. Late 60s, maybe older, skin weathered from decades of outdoor work, hands strong despite the arthritis I could see swelling her knuckles. She straightened slowly when I approached, one hand bracing her lower back. I asked if she needed help with anything. Odd jobs, yard work, whatever she had. She studied me for a long moment, taking in my blistered hands and thrift store clothes and the desperation I was trying to hide. Then she nodded toward the fence line running along her property. Posts need replacing before winter. Been putting it off for 2 years. Pay you $12 an hour, 3 days a week. Cash. $12 an hour was half what I made at the design studio, but it was $12 more than I had now. I took it. The work was brutal. Digging out old posts, sunk deep in clay soil, wrestling new ones into holes that never seemed quite straight, mixing concrete to hold them firm. Hazel worked beside me the first day, showing me how to use a post hole digger, how to plumb the vertical with the level, how to tamp the soil tight enough to hold against winter winds. She did not talk much, just demonstrated and watched me fumble through the learning curve and corrected me when I went wrong. By the end of that first day, my shoulders screamed and my back felt like someone had driven a spike through the base of my spine. Hazel paid me in cash from a coffee can she kept in the barn, 3 20s and a 10 and 2 1s, and told me to come back Thursday. I drove home with $72 and the knowledge that my body was not built for this kind of labor. But bodies could be rebuilt. I had learned that already. Hazel turned out to be more than an employer. She was a teacher by default, a woman who had lived alone on this land for 5 years since her husband died and learned everything the hard way. She showed me how to identify wild edibles growing along the fence line, bitter greens that could stretch a grocery budget if you learned to like them. Taught me to check the weather by watching how the chickens behaved, how the clouds moved, how the wind shifted. Shared canning jars and old mason lids when she learned I was trying to preserve food for winter on a budget that did not allow for mistakes. She never asked why I was living in a Quonset hut 6 miles from town. Never pried into the grief I wore like a second skin. She just treated me like someone capable of learning, someone worth the time it took to explain. That meant more than the $72 a week. I found the envelopes on a Thursday evening in late June, tucked into a pocket sewn inside the back cover of Garrett's notebook. 12 of them, letter-sized, each one sealed and numbered. My hands shook as I laid them out on the dirt floor of the hut, Scout watching with her head tilted in that way that meant she sensed something significant happening. Envelope 1, open when you finish the roof. Envelope 2, open when you feel alone. Envelope 3, open when winter comes. They continued like that, instructions for moments Garrett must have anticipated. When you doubt, when you succeed, when you remember. Each one a message he had written before he knew he would not be here to say the words himself. I picked up envelope 2 and held it to the light from my battery-powered lantern. The paper was thick, good quality, the kind Garrett used for important documents. Inside would be his handwriting, his voice speaking across the months that separated his last conscious thought from this moment where I knelt on a dirt floor trying not to fall apart. I could open it. I wanted to. Wanted his words like water, like air, like proof that some part of him still existed beyond memory. But the envelope said, "When you feel alone," and I was not alone. Scout pressed against my leg, warm and solid. Hazel had smiled at me today when I finally got a fence post perfectly vertical. The checkout woman at the hardware store knew my name. Alone was not the right word for what I felt. So I put envelope 2 back with the others and slid them into the pocket where Garrett had hidden them. I would wait. I would follow his instructions. If he had planned this carefully enough to number them to right conditions for each opening, then I owed him the discipline to honor that. Besides, rationing his words meant he could last longer. 12 envelopes could stretch across months if I was careful. 12 moments where Garrett would speak to me again, guide me, remind me why I was doing this. I could not afford to waste them. July burned hot and dry. The hut turned into an oven during the afternoons, metal walls radiating heat that made the air shimmer and sweat pour down my spine even when I sat still. I worked early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the brutal midday sun, focusing on repairs that would matter when temperature swung the other direction. The roof came first. 23 holes ranging from pinprick to fist-sized, each one a place for rain or snow to enter. I patched them with aluminum flashing cut to overlap the corrugated ridges, sealed every edge with silicone that smelled like vinegar and dried hard as stone. It took 4 days, and most of one paycheck from Hazel, but when the afternoon thunderstorms rolled through in late July, the interior stayed dry, which meant I could open envelope 1. I waited until evening, until Scout was fed and the heat had broken and the light was soft enough to read by. Sat cross-legged on the dirt floor with the envelope in my lap and let myself feel the weight of this moment. The last time Garrett would tell me he was proud. The last time his voice would exist in present tense instead of memory. My hands were steadier than I expected when I broke the seal. Inside 2 pages. The first was a diagram, precise and detailed, showing how to install a raised floor using the pallets already in the hut, plus lumber I could buy cheaply at the building supply on the south end of town. Measurements, materials, list, step-by-step instructions. Classic Garrett solving problems with engineering and math. The second page was a letter. "Ren, if you're reading this, you finished the roof. I'm proud of you. I know how hard that must have been. I know your hands hurt and your back aches, and you're probably wondering if this is all insane. It's not insane, it's survival. And you're stronger than you think. You always were. I just wish I had told you that more often when I was there to say it. The floor is next. Don't skip this step. Moisture rising from the ground will ruin everything if you don't create a barrier. Follow the diagram. Take your time. You can do this. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't get to build this with you, but I believe in what you're building." His signature at the bottom, the G in Garrett looping large the way it always did. I read it 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my pocket, the paper warm against my ribs, and cried for the first time since moving on to the land. Not the choking grief that had ambushed me in the months after he died, but something quieter, something that felt almost like gratitude. He had known. Somehow he had known I would need this. Building the floor took 2 weeks and every remaining dollar of that month's budget. Hazel let me borrow her truck to haul lumber from the supply yard. 6 trips total, the bed loaded with 2x4s and plywood sheets and the galvanized screws Garrett specified in his diagram. I worked in the relative cool of morning, Scout, lying in the shade and watching me measure and cut and curse when pieces did not fit the way they should. The pallets became the foundation, spaced according to Garrett's measurements to support the weight above. Framing went on top 2x4s, forming a grid that would hold the plywood decking. I leveled each section, obsessively checking and rechecking with the tool Garrett had marked essential in red ink. A floor that was not level would never feel right, would announce its failure with every footstep. My hands evolved. The blisters that had broken and bled in June hardened into calluses that cracked, less hurt, less gripped tools, with a sureness I had never owned before. I learned to read wood to see which boards would split and which would hold, to feel the difference between tight and too tight when driving screws into joints. Garrett's voice lived in the notebook and in the envelopes, but also in my hands now, in the knowledge building itself into muscle memory. By mid-August, I had a floor, raised 8 inches off the dirt level within a quarter inch across its entire span, solid enough to hold furniture if I ever owned furniture again. I swept it clean and stood in the center of the hut, bouncing slightly on the plywood, testing its integrity. It held. Everything held. Scout immediately claimed the center as her sleeping spot, turning 3 circles before lying down with a satisfied grunt. Official approval. The town started noticing me by then. Hard not to when I showed up at the hardware store twice a week, covered in sawdust, buying supplies in small quantities, paying cash that I counted out carefully from an envelope in my pocket. The cashiers learned my name, started setting aside damaged goods. They could not sell things with dented packaging or missing hardware, offering them at a discount. One of them, a woman maybe 10 years older than me with kind eyes and a smoker's rasp, pulled me aside in early September. "You're the one living in the old Quonset out on Mill Road, aren't you?" I admitted I was. She studied me for a moment, weighing something. Then, "My brother says you won't make it through winter. Says that place is a death trap. No insulation, no heat source. Says you're either stupid or desperate." I asked which one she thought I was. I think desperate people do stupid things sometimes. But I also think underestimating a woman who's still standing after everything tries to knock her down is a mistake men make a lot. She sold me insulation batting at cost that day and threw in a box of nails that had been sitting in the damaged goods bin for 2 years. Told me to come back if I needed anything else. I drove home thinking about assumptions, about how easy it is to look at someone's choices and declare them foolish without knowing the full equation. Yes, living in a Quonset hut was desperate. Yes, betting my last dollars on my ability to make it habitable was stupid in a dozen different ways. But stupid and desperate were still better than giving up. Hazel asked me about it the next day while we worked on her chicken coop, replacing wire mesh that had been chewed through by something enterprising and probably rabid. "People talking about you in town." I told her I had heard. "They think you're going to die out there." I asked if she thought that too. She hammered a staple into the wooden frame before answering. "I think you're tougher than you look. I think Garrett was a smart man to prepare for a day like this, and I think most people can't imagine living with less because they've never had to." Then she handed me the staple gun and showed me how to pull the wire taut before securing it, a lesson that had nothing to do with chicken coops and everything to do with life. August turned into September, and the temperature started its slow decline. Mornings came cooler, evenings darker. I could feel winter approaching like a train on distant tracks, inevitable and dangerous. The hut had a roof and a floor, but the walls were still bare metal, conducting cold instead of blocking it. I needed insulation before the real freeze came. Garrett's notebook had a section on this. Insulation is survival. Skip it, and you die. His bluntness was almost funny, except it was also completely accurate. I bought fiberglass batting in bulk, the cheapest R13 I could find, and spent 2 weeks stapling it between the metal ribs of the hut's interior. Pink clouds of material that made my skin itch even through long sleeves, made my throat close up when I breathed the dust. I wore a mask Hazel loaned me and worked in short shifts, stepping outside every 30 minutes to let my lungs clear. Scout refused to come inside while I worked. She sat at the door and whined, unhappy with the smell or the dust or the way I looked like some pink abomination emerging from a cloud. Smart dog. The insulation made an immediate difference. Nighttime temperatures were dropping into the 40s now, and the hut stayed 10 degrees warmer inside than out, the metal shell no longer bleeding away every scrap of heat. But 10 degrees would not be enough when winter arrived in earnest. I needed a heat source. Garrett's solution was a rocket mass stove, a design that used minimal fuel to produce maximum heat, burning so efficiently that smoke was almost non-existent. The notebook included blueprints, material lists, warnings about proper ventilation. I read the section 5 times and still felt lost. Then Silas showed up. He appeared on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September, walking up the dirt road like he had every right to be there. 17 years old and too thin, wearing jeans that hung off his hips and a hoodie with holes in both elbows. Scout barked once, the warning kind, and I stepped out of the hut to see who was trespassing. He stopped when he saw me, hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look casual and failing. I could see the exhaustion in his face, the hollow look of someone who had not slept in a safe place for too long. "You're Wren Calloway." I confirmed I was. "My grandmother is Hazel Brennan. She said you might have space for someone to crash, just for a couple days." I looked past him, checking if anyone else was coming. Just him. Just this too thin kid with Hazel's sharp cheekbones and something broken in his eyes. "What happened?" He shrugged, a gesture that tried to communicate nothing and revealed everything. "Stepdad kicked me out. Mom didn't stop him. Gram can't take me because her house is too small and she's got health problems and I'm not going to be a burden on her." But he was fine being a burden on me, apparently. A stranger living in a metal hut with barely enough resources to keep herself alive. I should have said no. Should have explained that I had no extra food, no extra space, no capacity to take care of someone else when I was still learning to take care of myself. But I looked at Silas standing there trying to be tough while his shoulders shook slightly in the cooling air, and I heard Garrett's voice from some conversation years ago. "A home is meant to be shared, not hoarded. You can stay, temporarily, on 2 conditions. He straightened, hope flickering across his face. "You go back to school. I don't care what happened with your stepdad. You're 17 and you need to finish. And you help me build. I'm trying to get this place winterized and I can't do it alone." He agreed before I finished speaking. Silas moved in that night with a backpack containing 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and a science fiction paperback with a cracked spine. I gave him half the floor space and most of the blankets I owned. We ate dinner in near silence, canned soup heated on my camping stove, and I watched him shovel food into his mouth like he had not eaten in days. Probably he had not. That night I lay awake listening to him breathe on the other side of the hut, this strange kid who was now my responsibility, and wondered what Garrett would think. If he would approve of this choice or tell me I was being foolish, taking on weight I could not carry. But the envelopes in my pocket seemed heavier, like they were reminding me that Garrett had prepared for days when I would need help, when I would have to trust people, when survival meant community and not isolation. So I let Silas stay. He turned out to be better with tools than I expected, watched me struggle with the rocket stove design for 2 days before quietly suggesting a different approach to the air intake, something he had seen in a YouTube video about masonry heaters. His idea worked. Suddenly, the stove that had baffled me for a week made sense. We built it together over the course of October. Salvaged bricks from an abandoned chimney Hazel let us dismantle. Bought a length of stovepipe from the hardware store for $30. Mixed mortar according to ratios Garrett specified, and Silas double-checked on his phone. The design was simple in theory. A combustion chamber where wood burned hot and fast, a thermal mass made of brick that absorbed and radiated heat for hours after the fire died, and a chimney that vented outside. In practice, it was back-breaking precise work. Each brick had to be placed exactly right, mortared tight, checked for level. One mistake in the chimney angle, and the whole thing would fill the hut with smoke. I had nightmares about carbon monoxide, about waking up dead because I built the stove wrong. Silas seemed to have no such fears. He worked with a focus that surprised me, checking measurements twice, reading ahead in Garrett's notes, asking questions that showed he was actually thinking about the engineering and not just following instructions. "Your husband was smart," he said one afternoon while we waited for mortar to cure. I agreed. "Did he build a lot of stuff?" I told him Garrett designed buildings for a living but liked working with his hands on weekends. Liked the satisfaction of making something physical instead of just drawing it. "He would have liked this," Silas said, gesturing at the half-finished stove. "Building something that matters." The simplicity of that observation hit me harder than it should have. Yes, Garrett would have liked this. Would have loved it, probably, this stripped-down problem-solving, this creation of shelter from scraps. He had dreamed of this life and died before he could live it. But I was living it now, for both of us. The stove was finished by late October. We loaded the combustion chamber with kindling and paper lit it with hands that shook slightly and watched the smoke rise straight up through the chimney and out into the autumn air. No backdraft, no leaks, clean burn. The bricks began to warm within 20 minutes. Within an hour the entire hut felt comfortable, the chill knocked back by radiant heat that would last long after the fire died. Silas grinned, the first real smile I had seen on his face, and I felt something in my chest that might have been pride. We had built this, us, with Garrett's instructions and Hazel's bricks and our own blistered hands. We had made warmth from almost nothing. Scout celebrated by immediately claiming the spot closest to the thermal mass curling into a ball and sighing with deep satisfaction. School started in September, and Silas went without complaint. He caught the bus from the highway turnoff every morning at 7, came home around 4, and worked on hut improvements until dark. He did not talk much about his life before, about the stepdad or the mom who let him get kicked out, but sometimes at night I would hear him breathing too fast, too shallow, the rhythm of someone fighting nightmares. I understood that. I had my own nightmares. The solar panels went up in early November. Garrett's blueprint was detailed but optimistic, assuming I had skills with electrical work that I absolutely did not possess. Silas turned out to be better at this than either of us expected. Something about a science fair project 2 years ago involving circuits and LEDs. We bought 2 used panels from a guy selling salvage equipment out of his garage, paid $200 that I could not afford, and mounted them on the hut's south-facing slope. Wiring them to the battery bank Garrett specified took 3 days of trial and error. The first test blew a fuse. The second resulted in nothing happening at all, just dead batteries and a growing sense that we had wasted money we did not have. The third test, with connections rechecked and polarity verified and prayers offered to whatever God-protected fools, produced a green light on the charge controller. Power. We had power. Not enough to run a refrigerator or a television, but enough for LED lights and a phone charger and the small radio Silas brought with him. Enough to push back the darkness after sunset to create a space that felt less like camping and more like living. That night we sat under electric light for the first time, Silas doing homework at one end of the floor and me reading Garrett's notebook at the other. Scout sprawled between us, and the hut felt almost like a home. The money was gone by mid-November. Every dollar from selling the house, every paycheck from Hazel, every scrap of savings drained away into lumber and insulation and stovepipe and solar panels. I had $43 left, and the first snow was forecast for the end of the month. Hazel paid me on a Thursday, and I stood in her kitchen counting the bills, doing math that refused to work. $72 would buy groceries for maybe 2 weeks if I was ruthless about it. Would not cover the water bill for the storage tank I needed to install before the ground froze. Would not touch the dozen other expenses that kept surfacing like rocks in shallow water. Silas needed winter clothes. His hoodie was not going to cut it when temperature dropped below freezing. That was another $50 minimum. I felt the panic starting to build, the same spiral that hit me in the bank parking lot 9 months ago when the manager explained foreclosure. Not enough. Never enough. The math would not work. Hazel was watching me. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and pushed one across the table. "You're doing the poverty math." I admitted I was. "Adding and subtracting the same numbers, hoping they'll change." "Yes." She nodded. "Did that myself after Harold died. Spent a year counting pennies and panicking. Then I realized the numbers weren't going to change unless I changed what I was counting." I asked what she meant. "You're counting money. Money comes and goes. What you should count is what you've built. You've got shelter, heat, light, water access if you drill that well, food growing in the ground if you planned ahead, things that don't show up in a bank account but matter more when winter comes. She was right, but right did not pay for groceries. I'm increasing your hours, she continued. 5 days a week through December. Winter prep on the farm. I need help and you need money. 18 an hour because you're worth it now. I started to argue, but she held up a hand. Don't. You're good help, reliable, fast learner. I'd rather pay you than hire someone else who'll quit after a week. This is business, not charity. But it was charity, and we both knew it, and I was grateful enough not to care. The accident happened on a Saturday in mid-November. We were installing the rainwater collection system, Silas on the roof, positioning the gutter while I worked below with the downspout. The metal was slick with morning frost, and neither of us thought about what that meant until his foot slipped. I heard the skid, looked up, saw him scrambling for grip that was not there. He fell 12 feet and landed on his left arm, the crack of bone breaking loud enough that Scout started barking. He did not scream, just lay there breathing fast and shallow, face white, arm bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. I knelt beside him, checked for other injuries, tried to remember first aid training from a decade ago. We need to go to the hospital. His voice came out tight. Can't afford it. Neither could I, but that did not matter. I got him into the car, Scout whining from the back seat, and drove 40 miles to the emergency room in Bend, going 20 over the limit the entire way. The X-ray showed a clean break in his radius. Fixable, not surgical. They said it, wrapped it in a cast, gave him pain medication, and a bill for $843 that I did not have. I paid it anyway. Handed over my debit card and watched my account balance drop to negative $617 and felt the floor disappear beneath my feet again. The bank would cover it, for now, but they would charge overdraft fees, and I was already behind on the penalty payments from last month, and the spiral was starting again. The same arithmetic of poverty that had no solution except more money that would not appear. Silas sat in the passenger seat on the drive home, arm in a sling, face gray with exhaustion and pain. He was 17. A kid. My responsibility now, whether I had planned for that or not. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I told him accidents happen. You can't afford this. No, I could not. But letting him sit there with a broken bone because I was scared of debt was not an option either. Some things mattered more than money. I was still learning which things, still figuring out where the line was between foolish and necessary. But keeping Silas safe felt necessary. We made it back to the hut as the first snow began to fall, fat flakes drifting down through the pines and settling on the roof we had just patched. Inside, the rocket stove held warmth. The solar panels charged batteries that powered lights. The floor stayed dry and level. I had built this. We had built this. With Garrett's guidance and Hazel's help and our own hands that bled and broke and kept working anyway. The money was gone, but the shelter remained. And maybe Hazel was right. Maybe I needed to count different things. Winter arrived with precision, the first serious cold snapping down on December 3rd like a door slamming shut. Temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 18, overnight frost coating every surface in crystalline white, the pines going silent as birds abandoned the forest for warmer places. I woke to frozen water in Scout's bowl and breath clouds thick enough to see in the dim light filtering through gaps around the door. The rocket stove proved itself immediately. 3 small splits of firewood brought the interior temperature up to 62 degrees within an hour, the brick mass radiating heat long after the flames died. Silas sat close to it, doing homework with his broken arm tucked against his chest, still healing but functional enough that he could manage most tasks one-handed. We had learned to work around his limitations, to divide jobs according to what he could grip and what I needed to handle alone. The cast would come off in 3 more weeks. Until then, we moved carefully, aware that another accident would break us in ways bones could not heal. Money remained tight, but Hazel's increased hours kept us afloat. I worked her farm 5 days a week through December, winterizing equipment and reinforcing coops against the coming storms and stacking firewood in her shed until my back screamed. The physical labor had changed my body over the past months. Muscles appeared where softness used to live. My hands no longer looked like they belonged to someone who worked with computers. Calluses ridged my palms. Scars crossed my knuckles. A permanent crescent of dirt lived under my nails no matter how hard I scrubbed. I looked like someone who survived by working. Felt like it too. Hazel paid me every Friday cash in an envelope, and I spent Sunday mornings at the kitchen table doing arithmetic. Grocery money, gas for the car, savings for emergencies that would absolutely happen. The numbers never quite balanced, but they were closer than they had been in October, close enough that I could breathe without choking on fear. Silas contributed what he could. He picked up odd jobs around town, yard work and snow shoveling for $20 here and $30 there. Saved most of it, but spent some on food. He insisted on buying himself pride that I recognized and did not argue against. 17 was old enough to feel the weight of being someone's burden. Let him carry what he could. The second week of December brought Hazel's accident. She called on a Tuesday evening, voice tight with pain and something that might have been embarrassment. She had fallen on ice outside her barn, landed hard on her right hip, could not get up. Could I come? I drove faster than the roads allowed, Silas beside me, gripping the door handle, Scout whining in the back seat. Found Hazel on the frozen ground where she had dragged herself to the barn wall, leaning against wood siding, with her face white and her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her right leg angled wrong, the kind of wrong that meant broken bones and emergency rooms and bills that would devastate her. We got her into the car, with movements that made her cry out despite trying to stay quiet. Drove to Bend. Waited 4 hours in the ER while doctors took x-rays and consulted and delivered news that sounded like a prison sentence. Fractured hip, surgery required, 6 weeks minimum before she could walk unassisted, 3 months before she could live alone safely. Hazel was 68 years old and lived by herself on 5 acres that demanded constant attention. She had no family nearby except Silas, no friends close enough to move in and help, no money for in-home care or rehabilitation facilities. The social worker spoke in sympathetic tones about options and resources, but what she meant was, this woman is going to have to figure it out alone. I sat in the waiting room while Hazel was in surgery and did math that hurt worse than any physical labor. She could not go home, could not manage stairs or cooking or basic care, could not pay for help. The farm would fall apart without her there, and she would lose everything she had built since her husband died. Silas sat beside me, cast resting in his lap, eyes on the clock above the nurse's station. We have to take her in. I told him we did not have room. We'll make room. She'd do it for us. He was right. She would. She had in fact already done it by giving me work when I needed it most, by teaching me skills that kept me alive, by treating Silas like family when his own mother would not. But bringing Hazel into the hut meant reorganizing everything, meant less space and more mouths to feed and complications I had not planned for. Meant responsibility that terrified me. Silas was watching me with an expression that looked older than 17. She can't be alone. You know that. Yes, I knew that. When Hazel came out of surgery, groggy and gray with pain, I sat beside her bed and made the offer. She could stay with us until she healed. We had room. We had heat. We would figure out the rest. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Just gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered thank you in a voice that cracked. We moved her into the hut 3 days later. Silas and I rearranged the floor space, creating a corner for Hazel, with blankets hung as makeshift walls and a foam pad we bought at the thrift store for $30. Got her settled with pillows supporting her healing hip, and Scout immediately claiming the space beside her bed, some instinct telling the dog that this human needed warmth more than the rest of us. Hazel looked around the metal shell that had become home and smiled despite the pain medication making her eyes unfocused. Cozy. It was not cozy. It was cramped and cold around the edges, and the bathroom situation was now complicated by someone who could not walk to the outhouse we had dug behind the tree line. We managed with a bedpan and a privacy curtain and dignity stretched thin but not broken. But we managed. Living with Hazel changed the dynamic of the hut in ways I had not anticipated. She could not move much, but her mind stayed sharp, her voice filling the space with stories about Harold and the farm and the decades she had spent learning to be self-sufficient. She taught from her foam pad, explaining how to preserve meat without refrigeration, how to make soap from lye and fat, how to identify which mushrooms were safe and which would kill you within hours. Silas absorbed it all, asking questions and taking notes like he was studying for finals. I listened while I worked on winterizing projects, sealing drafts and reinforcing the door, and preparing for the serious cold that was coming. Because serious cold was definitely coming. The forecast turned ominous in early January. A storm system building over the Pacific, moisture-laden air colliding with Arctic fronts, meteorologists using words like historic and unprecedented and life-threatening. Expected accumulation 40 to 60 inches. Duration 4 to 6 days. Temperature during -10 to -15 Fahrenheit. The town started preparing on January 7th. Grocery stores emptied of bread and milk and batteries. Hardware stores sold out of generators and kerosene heaters and rock salt. Everyone who could leave did, heading south to Portland or east to relatives in safer climates. Those of us who stayed began the calculus of survival. I reinforced the hut's weak points with extra insulation, tacked plastic sheeting over the door to create an airlock, stacked firewood under a tarp where we could reach it even in deep snow. Bought 20 gallons of water and 50 pounds of dried beans and rice, spending money we barely had because the alternative was starving if we got snowed in. Silas checked the solar panels, cleared snow off the roof before the storm hit, made sure the battery bank was fully charged. Hazel directed from her bed, offering advice based on blizzards she had survived in decades past. Scout seemed to sense something coming, sticking close to all of us, whining at the door when wind began to pick up. The storm arrived on January 10th at 3 in the afternoon. Snow started falling thick and fast, flakes the size of quarters, driven sideways by wind that howled through the pines like something alive and hunting. Visibility dropped to 0 within an hour. Temperature plummeted. I fed the rocket stove and watched the thermometer inside the hut, willing it to hold steady as the world outside turned white and violent. 61 degrees. Holding. By nightfall, we were completely snowed in drifts, climbing the walls of the hut, burying the car, erasing any landmark that might have helped us navigate. The wind screamed without pause, a freight train sound that made conversation impossible and sleep unlikely. I lay awake, listening to it test the structure, looking for weakness, trying to peel the metal back and expose us to the killing cold. The hut held. Day 2 brought no improvement. Snow continued falling, wind continued screaming, temperature outside dropped to -12. I burned through our firewood faster than planned, feeding the stove every 3 hours to maintain interior warmth. We ate sparingly, rationing food in case this lasted longer than predicted. Hazel slept most of the time, the pain medication and the storm's pressure system combining to keep her under. Silas read by LED light, the radio playing news about power outages and accidents and people dying in their cars because they thought they could outrun the weather. We were lucky. We had shelter and heat and food. Others did not. The knock came on day 3, mid-morning, barely audible over the wind. At first I thought I imagined it. Then it came again, urgent and desperate, and I fought my way through the snow piled against our door to find 4 people standing in waist-deep drifts. A man, a woman, 2 children, maybe 7 and 9 years old. The man's lips were blue. "Our power's out. Heat stopped working. We can't survive another night." I did not think. Just stepped back and pulled the door wider. "Get inside." They stumbled in, bringing snow and cold and the smell of fear. The children were crying, fingers white with frostbite beginning. The woman looked at our rocket stove, putting out heat, and actually sobbed. I got them settled near the thermal mass, wrapped the kids in blankets, made weak tea with precious water because they needed something warm inside them, asked where they lived. 1/4 mile down the road. Power had failed on day 1. They tried riding it out, but the temperature inside their house dropped below freezing overnight, and they knew they would not survive another cycle. So they walked through the storm, fighting drifts and wind, and the very real possibility of getting lost 30 feet from safety. Hazel spoke from her corner voice, rough but clear. "Anyone else out there without heat?" The man thought 3 other families, maybe 4. I looked at the hut doing capacity math. We had room. Barely. We had heat. We had food for a week if we stretched it. We could fit more people if we packed them in tight. The woman was watching me, hope and desperation fighting in her expression, waiting for me to make a decision that would determine whether her family lived or died. I thought about Garrett's words in one of the unopened envelopes, something about a home being meant to be shared. Thought about Hazel letting Silas and me in when we needed it. Thought about the fact that I had heat because I followed a dead man's instructions and got lucky, and luck should not be hoarded. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Silas helped me dig a path. We're bringing them in." The next 6 hours were chaos and purpose combined. Silas and I fought through the blizzard, following the man back to his house and then to the 3 other homes nearby. Found 9 more people, elderly couple, single mother with 2 teenagers, family of 4 with a baby, not yet 1 year old. Guided them through whiteout conditions to the hut, packed them inside until we were shoulder to shoulder, body heat combining with the rocket stove to push the temperature up to 68 degrees. 13 people total plus Scout, who seemed delighted by the crowd, and the children who immediately wanted to pet her. Hazel directed the chaos from her bed, assigning spaces and organizing food preparation, and making sure the smallest children stayed closest to the heat source. I fed the stove, constantly burning through firewood and hoping it would last, hoping the chimney would not fail, hoping we had not just created a death trap by packing too many bodies into too small a space. But the alternative was letting people freeze. That was not an option. We survived that way for 3 more days, sleeping in shifts, sharing food that got thinner each meal, telling stories to keep the children from panicking. The elderly man turned out to have been a teacher, and he led the kids through math problems and geography lessons like we were not trapped in a metal tube while a blizzard tried to kill us. The single mother knew every song from the past 40 years and taught us harmonies that filled the space with something other than wind. Hazel held court from her corner, dispensing wisdom and dark humor in equal measure. The baby slept against the warmth of the thermal mass. Scout curled around it like a protective barrier. We became a community in those days, not by choice but by necessity, learning each other's rhythms and fears and strengths. Learning that survival is not a solo sport. The storm finally broke on day 6. Wind died first, then snow stopped, then weak sunlight filtered through clouds that looked exhausted. I dug us out through drifts that reached the hut's roof peak, creating a tunnel to the outside world. The landscape had been transformed, everything buried and smoothed and alien, but we had survived, all of us. The families left slowly over the next day as roads got cleared and power returned to their homes. Each one thanked me with words that felt too big, too meaningful, like I had done something heroic instead of just opening a door. The woman with the blue-lipped husband hugged me hard enough to crack ribs. "You saved us. You know that, right? We would have died." Maybe. Probably. I did not know how to respond, so I just held her and said nothing. The elderly couple left last, moving slowly through snow that was still thigh-deep in places. The man paused at the door and looked back at the hut, at the stove still radiating heat, at the structure that should have been a death trap and instead became a sanctuary. "I was wrong about you." His voice quiet enough that I almost missed it. "When I heard about the woman living in the old Quonset, I thought you were crazy, thought you'd be dead by Christmas. But you're the sanest person I know. You built something real." After they left, it was just us again, me and Silas and Hazel and Scout. The hut felt enormous and empty after 6 days of being packed tight. We cleaned in silence, putting things back in order, opening windows to air out the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Hazel watched from her bed, eyes bright with something that looked like pride. "You did good, Wren. Garrett would be proud." I sat down hard on the floor, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. We had survived a blizzard that killed 14 people across the county, had sheltered 13 neighbors when they had nowhere else to go, had proven that this mad experiment in living with less was not just survivable, but shareable. The newspaper came the following week, a reporter who had heard about the hut and wanted to write a human interest story. I tried to say no, but Hazel overruled me, pointing out that sometimes people need to know that hope is possible, that starting over is survivable, that community still exists if you build it. The article ran on the front page of the county section, "The Tin Angel: How One Woman's Survival Shelter Saved a Neighborhood." The reporter had talked to the families who sheltered here, had gotten quotes about the rocket stove and the solar panels, and the woman who opened her door when people were dying. I hated reading it, hated seeing my grief and my desperation turned into inspiration, hated the way they made it sound noble instead of necessary. But Hazel cut the article out and pinned it to the wall, and the families brought food and firewood as thank you gifts, and something shifted in how the town looked at me. I was no longer the crazy woman living in a hut. I was the woman who had built something worth protecting. The consulting offers came in February. 2 solar installation companies had read the article, seen the photos of my DIY panel setup, wanted to know if I would be willing to advise on residential off-grid systems. Part-time, remote, $750 a month combined. I took both jobs without hesitation. The money changed everything. Not enough to be rich, but enough to stop the constant arithmetic of poverty, enough to buy food without calculating every calorie, enough to save for the emergencies that would keep coming. I worked from my phone, answering questions about panel angles and battery capacity and system sizing. Turned out years of watching Garrett design buildings had taught me more about engineering than I realized. Hazel healed slowly but completely. By March she could walk with a cane, by April without assistance. We talked about her going back to her farm, but the conversation always ended the same way. "I like it here. You need the help. Let me stay." So she stayed. We built her a small addition to the hut in April, framed out a room 8 by 10 with salvaged lumber and a door that closed. Her own space, privacy, dignity. She cried when we showed it to her, this fierce woman who had survived everything breaking down over a plywood room. The garden went in during May. Hazel directed while Silas and I broke ground, 50 square feet of raised beds filled with compost and soil we bought in bulk. Planted vegetables that would mature before frost, lettuce and radishes and beans and tomatoes. Added chickens in June, 4 hens that Hazel's neighbor was rehoming, and suddenly we had eggs every morning. The hut was becoming a homestead. Slowly, one project at a time. I opened envelope 12 on a quiet evening in late May, sitting outside while Scout dozed at my feet and the sun painted the pines in amber light. The envelope said, "Open when you've found home." Home. The word still felt too large for what I had built, but maybe that was the point. Maybe home was not supposed to feel complete. Maybe it was always becoming, always evolving, always one project away from finished. Inside the envelope, Garrett's wedding ring and 2 pages of his handwriting. Wren, if you're reading this, you made it. You built a life from almost nothing. You proved that starting over is possible, that loss doesn't have to mean the end. I'm so proud of you I can barely find words big enough to hold it. You were always stronger than you believed. I just wish I had been there to see you figure that out. This ring was supposed to stay on my finger until I died. I wanted it buried with me. But I'm guessing if you're at this envelope, you're alive and I'm not, and you need it more than I do. Sell it if you have to. Or keep it as a reminder that you were loved completely, that our time together mattered, that the foundation we built still holds even though I'm gone. I love you. I believe in you. I am proud of you. Build the life you need, not the one I planned. And know that wherever you are, whatever you've become, I am proud of you. Always. The ring was warm in my palm, gold worn thin from years of wear. I sat there holding it while the sun set and the light faded, and my face got wet with tears I had not cried in months. Scout pressed against my leg, her weight steady and real. Hazel found me like that, came outside and sat beside me without speaking, put her arm around my shoulders and just held on while I cried for the man who had loved me enough to prepare for the worst, for the life we lost, for the one I was building without him. She did not say it would be okay, did not offer platitudes or false comfort, just sat there being present, being solid, being the kind of friend that does not need words. When I finally stopped crying, she squeezed my shoulder once and stood. "Come inside when you're ready. I made soup." I slipped the ring onto my right hand fourth finger where it settled like it belonged. Then I followed Hazel inside where light spilled from LED bulbs and warmth radiated from brick and home smelled like vegetables and bread. Silas's mother called in June. Hazel answered because I was in town and Silas was the only other person in the hut. I came back to find him sitting on the floor with tears streaming down his face, phone clutched in his hand. "She wants me to come home." His mother had divorced the stepdad, found an apartment, wanted her son back. I asked what he wanted. "I want to stay here," his voice breaking on the words. "This is home, your family. I don't want to leave." I sat down beside him, Scout immediately pushing her head into his lap. Thought about what Hazel had said about letting people carry what they could, about not holding on when letting go was the kindest thing. "You need to go back to your mom. She made a mistake, but she's trying to fix it. You deserve a chance to be her son again, to have that relationship, and she deserves a chance to be your mother. But what about here? Here is always yours. This will always be home. You can come back anytime, stay as long as you want. That doesn't change just because you live somewhere else." He left on a Saturday in late June, packed his backpack, the same one he had arrived with 9 months ago, now supplemented with clothes and books and tools we had accumulated together. His mother pulled up in a sedan that looked too clean for someone who had been living rough, and she got out with her hands shaking. Silas hugged me before he left, long and tight enough that I felt his heartbeat through his ribs. "Thank you for letting me stay, for teaching me, for everything." I told him he taught me just as much, that watching him survive made me believe I could too. His mother approached carefully like I might be angry. "I don't know how to thank you, for taking him in, for keeping him safe. Take care of him. That's thanks enough." They drove away down the dirt road, dust rising in a cloud behind them. Scout barked once, confused about where her person was going. I watched until the car disappeared, and then went inside where Hazel was pretending not to cry. We adjusted to being two again. The hut felt emptier without Silas's energy, without his questions and his jokes and his teenage metabolism that required constant feeding. But he came back every weekend like I promised he could, bringing his homework and his appetite and updates about his life in town. He was doing okay, better than okay, healing in ways he needed to. I opened the workshop in July, rented space at the community center one Saturday a month, charged $20 per person, taught basic off-grid skills to anyone who wanted to learn: solar panel basics, rocket stove construction, water collection and purification, food preservation without refrigeration. 12 women showed up the first month, 23 the second. By September, I had a waiting list and people driving from 2 counties over to attend. One of them was a man named Callum Thorne. He appeared in August with a daughter who looked about 10, both of them wearing hiking boots and carrying notebooks like they meant business. Introduced himself after the session, voice quiet and respectful. "My wife died 2 years ago. I'm trying to teach Ivy skills her mother would have wanted her to know: self-sufficiency, confidence, how to not be helpless." His daughter was watching me with serious eyes, listening to every word. I asked what brought him to the workshop. "Read the newspaper article about the blizzard, about what you built. Thought maybe you could teach us something about being prepared." We talked for 20 minutes after everyone else left about grief and survival and learning to live in the shape loss creates. He understood in a way most people did not, this shared language of widowhood that needs no translation. His wife had been his high school sweetheart. They had Ivy late after years of trying. She died of an aneurysm while putting groceries away, just gone between one breath and the next. He was 41 and raising a daughter alone and trying to figure out how to be enough. I knew that feeling. He came back in September, and the month after. Always with Ivy, always taking careful notes, always asking thoughtful questions. We started talking outside the workshops, coffee at the diner in town, walks along the trails near his house where Ivy and Scout could run together. Nothing rushed, nothing desperate. Just two people learning to be people again, finding their way back to connection. September arrived with cooler nights and the knowledge that I had survived a full year. 12 months since I moved onto this land with nothing but grief and a dead husband's dream and a dog who trusted me to figure it out. I was 35 years old and owned 2.3 acres free and clear. Had a hut that was weather-tight and warm and expanded to fit the people who needed it. Had consulting work that paid enough to live on. Had a garden producing food and chickens laying eggs, and a community that respected what I had built. Had Hazel living in the addition she helped design. Had Silas visiting every weekend. Had Scout aging gracefully gray, spreading across her muzzle but her eyes still bright. Had the possibility of Callum waiting patient and quiet on the edges of my life, not pushing, but present. Ready when I was ready. I sat outside one evening in early September and looked at the hut in the fading light. It was not beautiful. The metal was still rusted and patched, the whole structure clearly salvaged and desperate. But it was solid. It held. Inside, Hazel was cooking dinner on the camp stove, humming something tuneless. Scout was asleep in her favorite spot near the thermal mass. Garrett's ring sat warm on my finger, a reminder of who I had been and who I was becoming. I was not broken by grief. I had been sharpened by necessity, forged into someone capable of building shelter from scraps of turning loss into foundation. The woman who lived here was not the same person who lost her husband in a tomato patch 16 months ago. She was someone harder and softer simultaneously, someone who knew how much she could carry and was not afraid to ask for help carrying more. I was no longer the woman who lost her husband. I was the woman who found herself in the ruins and built something worth keeping. Scout lifted her head and looked at me through the window, patient and present, waiting for me to come inside where warmth lived, where family gathered, where home was not a place you inherited, but a thing you created one nail at a time. I stood and walked toward the door, toward the light spilling out into gathering darkness, toward the life I had built with bleeding hands and a dead man's notebook, and the stubborn refusal to let grief win. The hut held us. That was enough.